Welcome back, part two, to a conversation between myself, Andy Ferguson, Ferial, Puren, my co-host, and James-Gien Wong. Is that the right way to say your name, Gien Wong? Yeah,
yep.
Good, thank you. We've put this together, this conversation, as part of our work to try and help people understand themselves and the world a little bit better so that they can come to a better accommodation with the world and live a more joyful, rewarding and fulfilling life. That's the kind of premise of what we've been doing, and over the last year we've put together a 12-week course. Well, it's actually the first part of a 3-part course is 12 weeks, and within that we're really trying to help people understand who they are and their relationship with the world, and which nicely segues into the next piece that we're going to ask Dean about, because he has been pulling a whole bunch of strands of stuff together to help people understand themselves and that which is not themselves, that thing outside themselves. And he's got this wonderful diagram that he's about to show us, and we were just joking in between the break there that I don't even begin to understand what the hell that diagram is, right? There's so much stuff packed into it. It's like, what? So,
what is it?
At the risk of going, what the hell? Again, Ferrell's about to put this up on the screen. It's over at you, kid. Try and explain it in a way that, you know, somebody is as innocent as I can understand it.
Yes, and me. Okay.
Go for it.
So hopefully if we're going to understand it, then you're going to understand it. So I'm sharing,
Yeah.
I'm going to be sharing my screen in a moment.
Okay.
To just get us all into the loop of things.
There we go.
There we go. So Gien, you can take it from here now.
Okay. I don't see it yet. I'm just waiting for it. Okay.
Let us know when you're seeing it. But to be honest,
yeah, I see it.
Sharing.
Wow.
What the hell is
more
that?
More complex than I remember.
What the hell is that?
What
right?
is that? What the hell is that thing?
So I'm gonna just zoom out a little bit so they could see.
Am I supposed to explain that thing?
Yeah, well, you made it, so don't expect us to explain it.
I think I must have been on drugs that night.
Yeah.
Hopefully it was magic mushrooms. You created magic. Okay, I do know
maybe ayahuasca. Ayahuasca journey.
Yes, I think it's a ayahuasca journey, but it's a journey we definitely need to know about. So dig in.
We have to dig into the deep humanity journey because it's quite deep. So we have to dig quite deep here. Okay, so everybody you have to dig deep. That's
so your drawing is going to describe to us this concept.
Okay, the first
deep humanity.
Yeah.
Right.
The first thing I'd say in response to Andy's exclamation-laden sentence is that, it's a work in progress. So that's my excuse.
Okay.
And it's going to get even more complicated, in other words.
That really only geniuses can understand.
Even more confusing. It's a work in progress because that's actually, you know, a lot of times things like this, they're trying to simplify. So even though it looks complex, it's trying to simplify even more complexity. So that's the thing to say first. So just let me say a word about deep humanity first. So deep humanity is an open source protocol and a sense-making protocol for human beings to help them make sense of this space and time that we are in right now, in modernity, in the Anthropocene, where all these crises are unfolding one after another, and where we feel uncentered, untethered. We don't know what's going on. There's confusion. There's a new climate or inequality crisis every day. So why, you know, are we here? What brought us to this point? And so in deep humanity, there's this concept, there's different kinds of frameworks we integrate. And this diagram is kind of a mishmash of all these different frameworks. And you'll see there's a lot of unknown, I mean, there's probably a lot of terminology that you don't recognize and a lot of references to the different scientists in different fields. So the way to look at this diagram is it's a reference diagram. So in the same way that you would not pick up if you're, you want to relax and you go into your bedroom and you say, I'm going to pick up a book to read, right? You don't go and pick up the 1,000-page Oxford Dictionary. That's not your idea of enjoyable reading. So in the same way that you wouldn't do that, you wouldn't do the same thing with this diagram, because it's a reference diagram, right? So right now we're going through it out of the context of the research paper. So you actually have to look at the research paper or the book that's going to be in, probably in a modified form, in order to understand what it is, right? Because it's a reference support for all that other information. But that being said, I can so I think the way to look at this mess is as a map. Okay, so it's a reference map that you can look at, and if certain words make sense to you, that's great. If they don't, then just, and you're inquisitive, and that's great as well. What is that, right? So I think my task here is just to give you an overview of this map so that you can kind of just get the big picture of what it is. And then there's, each one of these subjects you can explore for huge amounts of time. I mean, each one is like a work of a group of scientists, as an example. So basically this is, you can look at this map as a map that tells you about the human being, the individual human being, and the collective, the group, okay? And you can look at this map, you can break it down in 3 different dimensions. Think of it as a 3-dimensional object, and there's 3 different dimensions, like a cube. There's an X dimension, there's a Y dimension, and there's a Z dimension coming out of the paper. So in the X dimension, you go left and right, horizontal. In the Y direction, you go up and down. And in the Z direction, you come into the screen and out of the screen, okay? So let's start with the first dimension, the X dimension. And there's a 0 point for this, which is that purple dotted line that's about 1/3 from the left. So that purple dotted line, okay? So that purple dotted line represents a separation between the left-hand side and the right-hand side. And the easiest way to understand that separation is using the color scheme. So most of the colors on the left or most of the blocks on the left are yellow in color. And most of the blocks on the right are gray in color. So there's some yellow parts in the right-hand side as well, but let's ignore that for now. And then there's one block called the subject, which is kind of goes to the right beyond the purple dotted line a little bit as well. So let's just ignore that for now. So roughly what the left and half show us is you think of yourself. So let's take Ferial as an example, okay? Ferial and Andy. So let's say Ferial is going to use this diagram to examine her own life. So then she would place herself in the yellow on the left. She is the subject, okay? That's Ferial, the subject. And actually the subject is not just the left of that purple dotted line, but a little bit to the right of that where it says biological. If you look down, it says biological in gray, about three squares down. And there's on the left, it says psycho. So it's psycho in yellow on the left of the purple dotted line and biological on the right. So that is just saying that the subject, Ferial, is a psychobiological being. She has 2 aspects to her, a psychological aspect, her inner life, her inner private life, which is made up of her emotions, which I know Ferial has a lot of. And see right there.
Everything, right?
and her mental world, her ideas, her thoughts, right? And she has a lot of those as well. Okay. So she has a lot of both.
Balance
then. So the gray, mostly to the right, represents the objective world. So it's basically the Cartesian dualism of subject and object. Okay. The subject is Ferial. So if Ferial is applying this to herself, this diagram to herself, she's the subject. So I, Ferial, am represented on the left by the subject, right? Then to the right is the objective world, the world outside of her. And that's where Andy would locate it, using Ferial as the subject. So she's the reference system, she's the subject. So in Ferial's world, she's the subject looking out her eyes through her glasses, her brown rimmed glasses. And she sees Andy on the screen and she sees me on the screen. So we're in her objective reality, right? And so we are psychobiological beings. That comes from a couple of psychology professors who wrote a psychology book in South Africa, named Jourdain and Jourdain, husband and wife team. And so they coined this word psychobiological to describe the human being, okay? And in fact, this diagram began as the basis of this diagram began in the cover of their psychology textbook. They had this amazing diagram which inspired me. So I basically took that and riffed off of it and came up with this. So this is I'm citing now, I'm doing a citation to Jourdain and Jourdain. So basically we are psychobiological beings, and the yellow represents the inner psychological world and the gray represents the outer objective biological world. So what that means for Ferial is that the private inner world is of her thoughts and emotions. She can express those, but if she chooses not to express them, she can keep them private. So if she has something that she wants to keep private and she has a thought, she doesn't have to use language, because using language is now translating that idea in her head, in her private world, into an acoustic signal through phonetics, through her vocal cords. And then that acoustic signal goes out and it comes out into the world and then ends up in our ears. And we transduce that acoustic signal back into ideas, right?
And,
so
and I have a lot of acoustic signals. But I turned out.
You're an amazing acoustic transmitter. But she has a biological side too. The biological side consists of her brain, as we can see there, and sensory and motor aspects. So sensory organs, of course, we all know the 5 sensory organs, 5 sensory modalities: sight, sound, touch, taste, smell. And she has her motor system, her muscles and her skeleton and her tendons, right? So that's her, and of course all her organs and so on as well. So that's her biological side and her brain.
So really, James, what I'm hearing you say is that I have this internal world, which is represented here in the yellow.
Yeah.
And then, so now it's starting to make a little bit more sense, all of the squiggles in the colors.
Yeah.
And the external world, which I'm touching that external world through my physical biological being, right? Because
exactly.
So yes. I am actually living in the internal and the external.
Exactly. So that's why you have 2 kind of separation lines. You have that purple dotted line that shows you that that's kind of your inner. That's actually to the left is your inner world, right? And then you have the biological in gray, but the subject, you see the subject spans to the left and it covers both the psycho and the biological. So your biological world is actually not your inner world.
Yeah.
It's part of the objective world because Andy can actually sense your biological aspect, right? Your body. We can see you on the monitor, on the screen. And if we were actually in person, if we touched your hand, we could feel it.
You could feel it, exactly. So
it basically, we can sense
from the drawing here in the center where I'm pointing right now, the biological, your biological is basically connecting the internal and the objective world.
Exactly. Yes. So you as subject, you as a subject straddle both the psychological inner private world, and you have part of your body is represented in the objective world, right? Yes. It's you, but it's also not you. It's not you in the sense that it's public. Other people can sense that part, but they can't sense your thoughts. Like right now, if you were to think of something, you think of a thought right now. See, I can't sense it, right? Obviously. But now you can reveal. Now say what you were thinking. Tell me what you were thinking. Okay.
What was I thinking?
Yeah.
Food.
Okay, there you go. See, I didn't sense that, right? I didn't see you salivating. You could have salivated. That way I could have sensed you, but you didn't salivate, right?
No.
So there's not necessarily signs, physical objective signs that indicate what's going on inside, right?
Okay, so before we disappear, hang on guys, just before we disappear into this diagram anymore, right? I just want you to draw us back, because this is part 2 of a conversation that we started in part 1. And when you were introduced, Gian, you were introduced as someone that's interested in rapid whole system change, okay?
Yeah.
So can you just go from the sort of microscopic with this thing and go back out into the sort of the bigger picture here and say, why does this, what is this diagram? What does this work? How does this support? How does this connect to this rapid whole system change do you think is necessary?
Okay, good question, Andy. This is all about sense making and knowing what we are as a human being. So this is what deep humanity is about. It's about unpacking all the things that make you human. And actually most of the things that make us human are actually very obvious and common sense, but it's not about knowing as much as appreciating, okay? It's not about, so this is very important. The distinction between deep humanity and just humanity or any other subject is the appreciation of the ideas. So these ideas are all common ideas. Every human being actually knows all these ideas, but knowing and appreciating are 2 different things. So deep humanity is here to actually help you to take you on a journey to appreciate what it is to be a human being and all these different things that we've taken for granted most of our lives, right? So that's one answer. Now another answer is I can answer this, but if you go, Ferial, if you scroll up to the top of the diagram a little bit, then I can use that part to show the viewers to answer Andy's question. So now the second dimension then, so this is a good segue. It's a premature segue, but we'll come back to the first dimension later. But the second dimension, the Y dimension, oops, it's loading again. We just lost a picture there. Ferial, are you there?
Loading, yeah, I have no idea why it's just loading. So
okay.
It says it's got something.
Okay, while you're doing that, I'll just talk to the audience. So the vertical dimension, the Y dimension, at the top is the collective. So you can think this diagram goes from the microscopic to the largest aspect of human society. So think of human beings, okay? Human beings, when we have a group of human beings, the largest group of human beings is humanity itself. So right now, humanity has almost 8 billion people, okay? So that's at the very top of the graph, of the diagram. The collective of all human beings at the top. At the bottom of the diagram is the microorganisms and the cellular structures that make up a human being. And in the middle is the individual human being itself. So the individual human being, there's 3 units of these individual human beings in this talk right now. There's me, there's Ferial, and then there's Andy. Okay, so we are in that middle layer, the individuals. There's 3 individuals. At the top, we are all part of a bigger society, bigger culture. So that culture, like for Andy and Ferial, they're in the UK. So you could say, for instance, if you want to look at national boundaries, it's 50 million people in the UK, or 60 million. I'm in South Africa, so I have 50 million people in South Africa. But you can also look at it as a whole of a humanity, 8 billion people at that top. Now, if you go to the bottom, that's now going to the microscopic level that makes up the human being. So that's like each cell of the human being, each DNA, all the microbes, the trillions of microbes that are currently living on our bodies in the ecosystems of the brain and the ecosystems of our gut and everywhere else.
So just for a little bit of clarity, I'm just trying to get my head around this. So why do you stop at you talk about at that micro level, you stop at the sort of molecules, right? Why don't you go into atomic level? I'm just curious. And at the other side of the coin, why not talk about all the people that came before us. You're saying modern humans have been around 100,000 years. So is it just the 7.8 billion of us now, or is it all of those humans? I'm just curious about the
okay, so yeah, good question. So it's really this, I'm focused on the human being. That's, that's why it's called deep humanity. It's not called deep biology. Because if I want to expand to all of the biosphere, then I would call it deep biology. So deep humanity means it's focused spatially and temporally on human beings. So that's not to say that the non-human human world is relevant. It's quite relevant, right? Especially when you're trying to contextualize yourself in that. So it's important as well. So just because we focus on that doesn't mean we're not also finding relevance in what's not that. Okay, it's just like your earlier comment in the first part of the talk, before the break, where we talked about boundaries, like the modern human. Where's the sharp demarcation point? There is no sharp demarcation point except the one we make, right? Science makes a sharp demarcation point, but it's arbitrary in a sense, right? To allow us to talk about things, right? So the diagram is back, and so you can see on the top, the green bar, that represents collective culture. So that's at the cultural level. So on the far left, you see the word levels at the very top left corner. And then you'll see, just zoom back out there, Ferial. So top left, you see the word levels. And then if you go down below that, there's the group level. And below that is the individual level. And then in the pink near the bottom is the genetic level, DNA and genetics. So like Andy said, responding to this question, you don't have to stop there. You can go to the atomic level if you want. You can go to string theory if you want, but we're focused on human beings, right? And some scientists argue that quantum effects actually play a role in defining human beings as well. And I'm sure that there's some truth to that, but for now, we're just focusing on kind of what's bound by the DNA up to the society culture. And so if you look at to the right of that purple dotted line, there's two arrows that make a loop. And those two arrows kind of show the relationship between the genetic level and the cultural level. And in fact, the book that I'm writing on deep humanity, the paper that it's based on right now, okay, I'll read the title. Ferial, do I have permission to read the title?
Go for it.
Okay, so it's a big mouthful of words, but I can break it all down for you.
I was going to say, that's what you're going to need to do.
Yeah. So actually, the fact that you looked at the diagram will help as well, okay? So, I bring the word evolution into this, and there's a slight variation of the word evolution. It's co-evolution, which means two different things evolving at the same time. So the two different things in this case are genes that are evolving, and then at the top level, culture that's evolving. So that will give you a context for the title. So the title is The Gene Culture Co-Evolutionary Roots of the Anthropocene and a Commons, I'll explain that, based in activists, I'll explain that, wisdom praxis, I'll explain that, to mitigate it. Part 1, framing. Okay. So now, what this whole mouthful of scientific terminology means is that in this paper, and a big part of the book, I'm using a scientific branch of knowledge called gene culture co-evolution, where this branch focuses on research that shows that what happens at the cultural level in society actually influences how our genes evolve. So what we do as a culture, whatever we do as a group of human beings, has an impact on the genetic pathway that is selected by our next generation of children, right? It's a very slow kind of process, but it does happen. It could be actually quite rapid, but genetic evolution is usually a slow process. Whereas cultural evolution is a very rapid process. And that difference in the rates of change is actually a big problem and why we have progress traps. Okay, but I'll go into that at another future time. So it's called the gene culture co-evolutionary roots. So this loop is showing that as genes evolve, they cause, they can actually influence culture to evolve a certain way. And then as culture evolves, it can cause genes to evolve in a certain way. Okay, so that's the gene culture co-evolutionary loop there.
Can I just ask? Can I ask a question? Just to try and use an example, maybe to get you to unpack something that might make that a wee bit clearer for us. There's I read a thing last year that says that because it's now, and I hesitate to use the word popular because that makes it sound quite trivial, but because women are getting cesarean sections more and more now, because that's became a thing, that the natural birth, the information, the genes, whatever that evolves humanity is getting interfered with because women who wouldn't survive childbirth are now giving birth, which means those genes have been passed on, which means there's actually a foreseeable future where women would not be able to give birth naturally because of a cultural choice. I say I don't want to trivialize it, but could you unpack that a little bit and maybe explain why that is could be a manifestation of what you're talking about?
No, that's exactly a manifestation of it. It's because it's like, first of all, you have cultural behavior. You know, having a cesarean section is a cultural behavior. It's you know, something that groups of people do. And so if your survival rate is increased by that, then those people who are having that might have certain properties. And if they survive better than people who don't, then their genes will actually be the fittest. And so they will be selected for, so on average, your probability will increase that they will be selected for fitness, right? That's an example, but there's so many. I mean, it's not, go ahead.
I think it's really interesting, right? Because I think that is why we are bringing you into having this conversation, because we're saying we really have to pay attention here, right? Some of this information that we're now learning, because look, before we didn't have a lot of this information, right? Because
that's right.
All of this is emergent. All of our understanding of who we are in relation to our world, in relation to each other, in relation to our ecosystem is emergent for us. So I love I love quoting her. There's a woman she's called, I'm sure you know her, the late Maya Angelou, but she used to say, "When we know better, we do better." Yes. And I'm hoping that humanity. That's why I'm wanting to have this conversation. I'm hoping that we do exactly that, right? That we now recognize we have an impact on our environment, and our environment has an impact on us in the way that we are evolving, right? So. Really interesting for me when I look at, let's say, many years ago. I mean, we could go back really far into our past. You know, as a species, where we lived in groups where we protected one another, and that's how we formed, I guess, communities. The start of that, because we realized on our own we could be quite easily attacked by predators, right? And then we started living together in a little community, and in a sense we were not just concerned for ourselves, we were concerned for our community that we were then a part of, right? And we see that same kind of, I want to say, feeling and behavior displayed many generations into our human experience. But then of late we start developing a lot more individualistic aspects, right? Our things like capitalism and ideas around this makes us want to look out for ourselves. But on an evolutionary scale, if you're really looking at that, if we continue that behavior, we will once again, it's almost like we will regress. We'll go back to being open to attack from our natural enemies because we are again alone. And in a way right now, as we experience the psychological crisis that we have with all this pandemic stuff, we see that playing out. The moment that this natural disaster, we're alone, we're feeling about, I mean, even the best of us, right? The people like myself and Andy and you and others who are even in that psychological space, we're feeling it.
Well, Ferial, just to pick up on that point, one of the things that happened this morning is my wife told me about a friend of ours whose mum's just died of COVID. And they're separated. They can't be with each other. I mean, the daughter couldn't be with the mum when she died. And I, you know, I'm very stressed at the moment because my dad's 89 and he's vulnerable. And one of the things that's really hit home for me over the last year with this COVID thing is that we are not comfortable. We do not feel good. We do not feel at our best when we are separated from the things that we love and the people that we love. You know, humans have evolved to need one another. It's a fundamental requirement of our existence.
So that's why I'm saying, if we're not going to pay attention, just everything that Gien's just shared here, if we're not going to understand that we are at an evolutionary space right now, if we continue to co-create with ideas like capitalism and other ideas, neoliberalistic thinking, all kinds of things like this, where we're separating ourselves so we could forward our personal enrichment, you know, like away from the enrichment of our society, then we, or our community, not necessarily our community, the people around us, right? Then we are putting in information into our cultural sphere that is going to influence the way that our genetics is going to display itself in the future. Which means as a society, we will not progress, but we will actually regress. So back to the original, when we were vulnerable and we could be attacked by anything. So really, the fact that, Gien, you explained, I am this individual on the yellow side of this diagram. I have this biological part of myself that is then connected to my external objective world.
Reality. Yeah.
Yes, which is where you and Andy and plants and trees and everything else is a part of. And if so what I'm taking away from, and you can correct me, and I want you to maybe just both have a bit of input into that, is what I'm taking away here is that if I'm only focused on my own well-being and I don't recognize that I am both fully individual, internal world, and I am also fully within the collective world. So I am collective and I'm individual. And if I don't take care of both of these at the same time, there is going to be great disparity, and there's going to be some more and more of the challenges we're facing. Is this
yes. Yeah, that's true. So let me just respond to that. I think just going back to COVID thing first, how the COVID thing manifests in this diagram is COVID is actually acting at the microscopic level, at the DNA genetic level, right? So that's the pink horizontal line, right? But you see, because we, you know, right now we're engaged in conversation. We have 3 different people and 3 different consciousness. So actually, let's look at this diagram a little bit now to understand how that diagram represents that. So now Ferial is engaging with Andy and I. She's on the left of that dotted line. But now, if you move to the right a bit, it says objective at the heading, the top heading. And then it's move your cursor, Ferial, so you can kind of move it to the block that says objective so people can see it, yeah? And then below that, there's a sub-block that says other humans, and then there's another one to the right of that says other species, right? So Ferial, yeah. So other humans, so that's where Andy and I sit with respect to Ferial, right? We're other humans. But you see, under other humans, we're like Ferial. We have a psycho-biological, we have a psycho aspect and a biological aspect. We have a psychological aspect, the mind, and our affective emotions, and the biological, you know, which consists of brain, our organs, our body, sensory, and motor aspects. So, but you see, here there's an assumption here that Ferial is making about other minds, and this is actually a big unsolved mystery in philosophy. Do other minds exist? Right? So you might think this is funny because the ordinary everyday experience of life is that yes, we accept that other minds exist.
Yeah.
But how do we know that other minds exist when we cannot sense them, right? It's actually an imputation or an assumption based on a lot of sensory data over the years since we were children, right? So we can't experience other people's inner world. We can only experience our own inner world. And so there's an assumption that there are other inner worlds out there. And if you go just below this this whole block here, just above the purple horizontal, the pink or horizontal line, there's something called Lebenswelt, Husserl, Lebenswelt. Do you see that? Can you put the cursor over that, Ferial? Lebenswelt, yeah, and it runs all the way across. So Lebenswelt is named after a scientist named Husserl, a phenomenologist, and basically he postulated that just exactly what we're saying, that we can't prove that there are other minds, we can't directly experience other people's inner reality, but we infer it and we use that as a practical aspect of living. So we cannot experience other minds the way we experience our own mind. And so it's an assumption, it's an imputation that they exist, but we're comfortable with that.
So really, I'm just unpacking what I'm hearing. So really, everything in the objective world, everything, including you, Andy, and everything, I'm using sensory data and assuming what it actually is.
Yeah, yeah. And in philosophy, a philosopher named David Chalmers actually created this concept of zombies. Do zombies exist? And this is a huge debate. If you Google David Chalmers and Chalmers and zombies, you'll get lots of, you'll see what it's all about. Okay, so there's a whole lot of concept of zombies. How do you prove that other minds exist, right? And another philosopher named Daniel Dennett, another famous philosopher, takes the opposite perspective from David Chalmers, and they have debates about it. Okay. So anyways, now, so that was just an aside, that just showing how to interpret this diagram. And I think what I was trying to get at was the COVID and where COVID fits into this. And somehow I diverged into that. I digress in that. But COVID is at the DNA level. And if you just move the diagram down a little, or else zoom out a bit. Okay, good. That's good. So we as individuals, 3 individuals talking, and the listeners as well, Ferial, Andy, and Gian, we are at the individual level, that horizontal line that says individual. And but we are composed of a whole bunch of cells, billions of cells, living cells, and trillions of microorganisms, right? In our gut mostly, but also in our brain and all throughout our body, on our skin surface. So basically, and then at the top is the culture. So now let's look at COVID and the pandemic with relation to this diagram. So we normally see the world through the lens of the individual level. And then we hear about the news from science about the genetic level, and we hear from sociologists and the media about what's going on with politics at the cultural level, right? But we exist at the individual level. That's where our kind of experience of everyday life is. But then all of a sudden, this virus comes, this molecule. It's not living, it's a biomolecule of strands of RNA. And it's at the microscopic level, but it impacts us at the individual level, right? And at the individual level, that's where consciousness, human consciousness exists. So, the listeners, you and I and Andy, we are all at that, we're kind of operating with our consciousness right now. And just as the consciousness is just as like, if you look at the cultural level, the group society level, the government kind of governs and sets policies for the people, for the individuals in the society. In the same way, in the same manner, our consciousness kind of governs our body. The high level decisions that we make, the policies that we set, like, I'm going to put a sandwich in my mouth, right? That determines the fate of all the other cells after that, right? If you decide to go swimming in cold water, then your whole body, every one of your cells in your body have no say in it, in a sense. They just have to respond to it, right? Our high level consciousness governs our body. right? But the COVID-19 kind of comes in at the microscopic level, but it affects both the individual level and the group level of our society. So I just
Okay,
wanted
so
to,
this is great. I'm appreciating that we're starting to kind of run out of time to a degree, and we can always, and I presume we will continue to have these discussions and go into both this a deeper level, the deeper dive into it, but also. But what I want to do is just pull the camera back a little bit and say, right, let's go back to the start again. You were introduced to somebody who was interested in rapid system, the whole system change, yeah?
Yes.
How does this detailed map, as you called it, this detailed reference thing, how does this relate to how you see humanity dealing with these multiple crises, the economic, social, political, etc., that you feel we're facing? How do we go from that to this big picture?
Okay, so you know, we each of us and the listeners all exist at the individual level, like I said, right? So that's where we live our lives, and that's where we're suffering our pain, as an example, right? So you mentioned a family member dying, and your father is vulnerable. That's at the individual. It's not the microscopic level. It's not at the culture level. It's at your individual family, close group level. And Ferial, you have the same, and I have the same as well. So each one of us is suffering economically. We're suffering health-wise, right? And mental health and physical health, right? So that's kind of the things that we're concerned about in our individual life. But that is connected to what goes on at the group level, at the collective level, right? And also temporally, like 5 centuries ago, that set the ball in motion for what is happening today, right? So if we don't understand that, then the solutions that we come up with will be short-term solutions, they'll be temporary solutions, and they won't make the system change that we want. So to make lasting change for everyone, we actually have to understand where the problem comes from. We have to frame the big picture so we know how we got here. You know, Andy, you were born, decades ago in Ferial.
You can see that I'm a young guy, right?
Yeah, I'm just guessing. I just said decades. It's safe to say decades. It's very safe. I didn't say how many decades. Right?
Yeah, six decades.
Okay, you're volunteering that. Okay. So.
Well, Gien's kind of in the same category as you, sir.
Yeah.
Ridiculous.
So you were born decades ago, right? But things that for you to make the kind of change in your life, as an individual, we have to kind of synchronize the change we make to make a big system change, and we can do it. We can make changes in our lives. But it's up to us to choose what we do, right? So we can choose to. So we say we have all these problems and crises in our lives. What do we choose to do to mitigate them right now, right? So we have choice, right? But if our choice is not guided by the bigger picture, then we're going to make choices guided by the smaller picture. Just what we know in our limited, what I call in our limited sensory bubble and our conceptual bubble, within just what we know, and not the expanded reality that was involved in putting us all here in the first place, right? Because it's like there's major ocean currents that brought us here, right? And now we're saying, but here in our own lives, we have these minor currents, which seem quite large in our own lives. But we have to understand how the major currents actually brought us all here, right? If we're going to attempt to try to find a solution for everyone that's going to be lasting, right? Otherwise, we're just going to be putting out fires. Our short-term solution will put a fire here, but then another fire will pop up because we're not in control of the bigger system. It's like there's a hole, we have to plug it. Then there's another hole and it leaks, and there's another one. We're just jumping from one to another. We have to look at the bigger picture, why it's so leaky.
Yeah, and that is really interesting to kind of just round it off here today. Thank you so much, Gien, for sharing all of that information. I think I could safely say we've all learned a lot, and I'm hoping that we're not just going to make that head knowledge, right? Because this is what keeps happening. I think we really need to stop making that heart knowledge. so that we begin to turn that into real solutions. And I think that's the reason why Andy and I created firstly this SRG, conversation, but also the Stop, Reset, Go journey, which we now have 12 students as part of 10 students, my apologies, 10 students as part of this. And the core statement that we designed this around, the whole course around, was the idea that if we want to have this sustainable, happy life, right, that most of us want, then all of us really want, that we have to be prepared to go on our own personal internal evolutionary journey. And this journey is only possible when we're connecting meaningfully with a accepting, kind of capable community that also has this ecocentric worldview that you've just talked about, outside of just yourself, right, or your little community. But it's the interest of the whole collective of us, and not just our own interest as in our interest, just our little society, but also even the organisms that are sharing this planet with us, right, which is part of our entire ecosystem. And when we engage with this type of community, it allows us for this community to help us, to assist us, to organize our individual unique resources in a way that we're expressing ourselves fully and meaningfully, as Andy said earlier, throughout each stage of our lives. And also having, from an evolutionary perspective, having that innovative, creative, resilience, set right into our DNA. So this was, I expanded a little bit on the sentence, but in essence, it was our sentence. And I would say that it really sums up what you've actually said we need to be doing. Right? So, and at the heart of that, I would say there are two things that are at the heart of all of that. So if I can leave that with our viewers today, and that is, first thing, we need to go on the internal evolution journey. That is your personal responsibility, to go and change what is in the inner world, to change the value system that is allowing you to create into the external world, right? Because now you're going to create something different into the external world when you've reset the value system inside. And then the second part was engaging with that ecocentric community. And hopefully myself, you, Andy, and others that we know are a part now of this community that we're wanting to build, that is looking outside of ourselves and looking at how do we establish something good, not only for ourselves, but for everybody around us and for the other organisms sharing the planet. So if I can leave that with you and say that all of this was about that conversation. So I'm going to ask Andy to just wrap up what he'd like to input just last, and then also Gian. Thank you, Andy.
I think you've done a marvelous job of summing up this idea that, and that's why I was asking Gian what I was asking, is that this idea that somehow we are separate from what happens to us, and what happens to us we can just blank out. I've been working with individuals for decades, and what I realised is the best way I can describe it is that we have to come to an accommodation that's working for our environment, but also works for us, because we're in a symbiotic relationship. We can only find a deep sense of purpose and humanity, to paraphrase Gian, that recognises our true nature and embraces our true nature, which is that we do want to have joyful, rewarding, fulfilling lives. But in order to do that, we have to find people to support us, people to challenge us. We have to find ways of sharing intelligence about what's going on in the environment, the threats, the opportunities, and we have to keep one eye on how we are affecting that environment and how it's affecting us. And there's this intermediary part of it, which is the community. So that all fits together. And what I would say to all three of us is that, we never stop developing. So we're always trying to ask those deeper, more profound questions that help us that line that Gian drew down the middle, or slightly to 1/3 of it, this me and the world, what is that relationship, and how do we keep adjusting it? Because Gian, the bit that I found really funny is, I was waiting for you to sort of disappear down that rabbit hole, was this idea of how do we know anything outside of ourselves exists? Well, we don't, but working, it's a practical approach to take, that it does exist, that there is something other than us, right? And we're just trying to understand that relationship, which is dynamic. And again, want to emphasize that point that you made, Ferial. It's not chunked. It's completely infinite in terms of its divisibility, right, Ian? But yeah, what you're working on, and I'll let you finish off in that sense, is that for practical purposes, we do have to consider it as not a gestalt, not a complete thing, but as a series of, and I think one of the current ones at the moment is a whole on, where something is complete in and of itself, but is also a part of these bigger processes. And I'm going to shut up now, because otherwise we're going to talk for another hour, right? So
yes,
it's been great sharing this with you two, and I'm out of here, so you two can just wind it up.
Thank you. And Gian, what do you want to just round up?
Just, I think the one thought that comes to mind in concluding is Thich Nhat Hanh's concept of interbeing, inter-are, that, and also the Ubuntu concept in Africa, I am because you are. That we're, so these divisions are actually only in our mind, but we are, the human being is actually completely integrated with the environment and vice versa. Everything that we are comes from the environment. Everything that you know and that you hold dear are ideas that were fed to you by your parents, your friends, something you read, something in the culture, in the media. So just as all that food that we've eaten over, like in Andy's case, six decades, has built this body called Andy. All those thousands of haggis and
yeah. Really,
I'm just making an assumption.
Oh no.
Yeah. Can't be haggis.
Yes. So with that haggis, we're gonna say goodbye. And thank you.
I just want to say one more thing.
Oh, is he still busy?
Yeah,
okay.
that wasn't quite finished there. So that was just Thich Nhat Hanh's inter-are and inter-being. That there's, we are the world and the world is us. But the other thing was riffing off what Andy said about nature and human nature. It's the same thing. Like human nature. So deep humanity is about human nature, but human nature is part of nature, right? So there's no boundary really, right? So we are part of nature, right? And the final thing is that reflecting what Ferial said, in Stop, Reset, Go, we have a kind of a complementary transformation strategy which reflects that. The human inner transformation process is significant, but then the social outer transformation process is just as important. So it's like kind of like yin and yang, they complement each other. You need to transform your inner world, not just value systems, but also how we actually create narratives themselves. How do ideas get a foothold, right, out of where there's nothing? In the dualistic world emerges from the non-dual world, right? Like here, at one time in our lives we didn't have language. So how did language emerge within us, right? And so how do ideas and narratives emerge? Because that's important, because the 70 million people who voted for Trump versus the 80 million who voted for Biden have completely different narratives, right? So we have to find out the nature in the human nature that gave rise to those conflicting narratives, because we all at the root have common human denominators, which make us human, right? So that deep humanity looks at that and brings us back to that point so that we can try to find unity with nature and with other human beings.
Yeah. So let's go out and look at what we have in common. Start from there. Don't focus on that which we don't have in common, right? So thank you so much for viewing. This is Ferial Puren, Andy Ferguson, and James-Gien Wong saying goodbye and hope to chat to you soon again.
Bye. Bye.